Welcome to the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, December 11th, 2020. My name is Pam, and let's begin. As vaccines roll out, states face difficult questions over access. By Amanda Paulson. Charlotte Evans is avidly watching the news about coronavirus vaccines, and as soon as one is available to her, she'll be lining up to get it. An elementary school librarian in Rock Hill, South Carolina, Miss Evans is at work 5 days a week, seeing 6 classes a day of children who are otherwise tightly potted with their classroom teacher. This is a hard way to teach, says Miss Evans, who also has a diagnosis that puts her in a higher risk category. For a lot of us, it feels more like a race. Can we get the vaccine before we get COVID? Assuming the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approves it, the Pfizer vaccine will likely be available around December 14th. Moderna's could be ready a week later. But with limited availability and high demand, one of the top questions has been just who the vaccine will go to. It's up to states to make those decisions. Last week, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices issued a non-binding recommendation for the top tier of vaccine recipients: frontline healthcare workers and residents of long-term care facilities, like nursing homes. And there has been widespread consensus that those are the populations who should be at the front of the line. But after that, it gets more complicated. Should older Americans be prioritized, even if they're able to isolate? What about younger, lower risk individuals whose jobs present opportunity for exposure? Where do teachers fit into the equation? Or individuals who are incarcerated or living in a homeless shelter? Should allocation guidelines prioritize protecting at risk individuals or getting society back to a semblance of normal functioning? And how will they fairly treat many disadvantaged populations who have suffered disproportionately under the pandemic? Any framework for allocation is trying to balance three competing goals, explains Alta Charo, a professor of law and bioethics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison: preventing hospitalization or death, slowing the pandemic overall, and trying to return key areas of public life to full function. Each of those goals leads you to somewhat different ordering of your priorities, says Professor Charo, who served on the National Academic Committee that produced a report on equitable vaccine allocation. Overlaying all of that is the general recognition that there are some groups that have been historically, and now by the pandemic currently, disproportionately burdened. It gets complicated because there is no right answer. Theory meets practice. One way that Professor Charo and others suggest health officials could balance those competing demands is to first focus on people who fall into multiple categories: essential workers who also have underlying health conditions, for instance. But while that might be the most ethical way to proceed, experts caution that it can also run afoul of basic practicalities. Distribution mechanisms and logistics are going to be extraordinarily difficult for states, many of which have already indicated they lack the resources they need. The Pfizer vaccine, in particular, needs to be stored at ultra cold temperatures and comes in a crate with 975 doses, which, when opened, needs to be administered within a matter of hours. It really is only practical to only drop into one location and vaccinate everyone you can in that one location, says Eric Toner, co-author of a report on vaccine allocation published by the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security. And there are competing goals between focusing on the priority groups first and getting as many people vaccinated as possible, adds Dr. Toner. Imagine a 20-something takes his grandmother to be vaccinated. You vaccinate the grandmother. Do you also vaccinate the 20-year-old? Or do you say no, come back in 3 months? There's a whole bunch of decisions like that. Guidelines and how they can get complicated. The guidelines suggested by the National Academy's report offer one way of balancing competing priorities. In those guidelines, the first tier to be vaccinated would include high risk healthcare workers and first responders, followed by people whose underlying health conditions put them at significantly higher risk, and older adults living in congregate settings like nursing homes. Phase 2 would prioritize teachers and K through 12 school staff, essential workers in high risk settings, people whose underlying health conditions put them at moderately high risk, and people in group living settings like homeless shelters, group homes, or prisons, and older adults. But ranking such categories, and even ranking within categories, can get complicated quickly. Many older Americans, for instance, are eager for a vaccine, but age by itself tells relatively little about their risk or overall health, especially if they're able to isolate, says doctors. Someone who is independently living comfortably in a home where they're socially isolated and getting Grubhub and groceries delivered is very different from someone in a nursing facility with multiple diseases in congregate living, says Monica Peek, a doctor of internal medicine at the University of Chicago and co author of a paper on prioritizing vaccine access during the pandemic. There's also significant pressure to expand groups. Understandable, but counterproductive, says Govind Prasad, a professor of health law and bioethics at the University of Denver and a co author with Dr. Peek. In one case, he says, people involved in funeral work were lobbying the National Sciences Committee to be included in their guidelines as healthcare workers. They're doing important work, but I'd hesitant to say we should assign the same importance to funeral directors as to intensive care nurses, says Professor Prasad. Many of the loose ranking suggested by advisory committees make sense, says experts, but they caution that the reality will probably involve a lot of overlap. It will be challenging to simply identify who is in each category, how to get the vaccine to them, and how to earn their trust, says Dr. Peek. It's going to be a complicated system of implementation for everything, she says. Marginalized communities at risk. Dr. Peek and others also hope states will consider equity issues when they make their plans. Many of the communities hit hardest by COVID-19 are also disproportionately low income with higher numbers of racial and ethical minorities. Simply slinging out certain racial groups for priority access can be problematic, but using guidelines that acknowledge these inequalities and give some priority using the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index might help, they say. Yuki Blackstock, the founder and CEO of Advancing Health Equity and a Yahoo News medical contributor, said she worries that the current categories may miss key people in marginalized communities, those who haven't had underlying health conditions diagnosed because of barriers to care, for instance, or people who work in hospitals, in cafeterias, or environmental services. There's this focus and funding given by the federal government to develop vaccines, but only a fraction of funds is given to state and local departments of public health to distribute these vaccines, says Dr. Blackstone. Given limited resources, it may be tempting for local health departments to target populations who are easier to access first, say experts. But doing so would mean missing many of the most vulnerable, as they may be the harder to reach. An older, medically fragile individual living in a crowded, multi-generational apartment is harder to find than someone in a nursing home, but has a similar risk profile. Similarly, healthcare workers in rural America may be fewer in number and much harder to reach, but keeping them healthy could have a huge impact on the people they serve, says Professor Prasad. It's important for the people setting these policies to think about not just getting to the lower hanging fruit, he says. Transparency and integrity will also be key. People will be willing to wait when they see people who have a good ethical reason to go ahead of them going ahead, Professor Prasad said. That trust may disappear if they see people with money or celebrities jumping the queue. What about inmates, teachers? Despite consensus about that first tier, states will arrive at different decisions about certain categories. Teachers are one. Broadly speaking, says Professor Charo, they may be healthier and less at risk than some other workers. But concern about transmission has closed thousands of schools, and reopening those schools is a top priority for many Americans. How quickly prisons should get vaccines has also been a contentious topic. With populations that are crowded and disproportionately older, minority, and with underlying conditions, not to mention that prisons have been a source of significant outbreak, many experts see them as having a clear moral and public health priority. But some guidelines have prioritized correction officers, but not prisoners themselves. And there has already been a backlash against the idea that incarcerated individuals would have early access. Polls show that not all Americans want to be vaccinated, but in the short term, allocating a scarce resource is a bigger challenge for health officials than gaining that trust. As fraught as many of the conversations are, that we're having them is something to be grateful for, says experts. Vaccines have been developed sooner and more effectively than many thought possible. Even for Americans who have no special priority, the wait must just be a matter of months. I think the thing this has brought to the fore, both the pandemic and the reaction to it, has been the fact that we're all in this together, says Professor Charo. Our next article, Love and the Law. Hindu-Muslim couple challenges India's marriage rule, by Sarita Santashini. In New Delhi in September, as India relaxed its lockdown restrictions, Nida Raman made the difficult decision to leave her parents' home. COVID-19 cases were still on the rise, but living with her family, she had come to conclude, posed a bigger risk to the life she wanted to lead. For 9 years, Miss Raman, a Muslim woman, had built a relationship with Mohan Lal, a Hindu man whom she met at university. But her family's position was clear. She could not marry outside her faith, and they would find her a Muslim match themselves. Ms. Raman was adamant. If you want to marry a good person, she believed, faith shouldn't stand in the way. Religion does not create boundaries like these, she says. So she moved out with the help of a nonprofit and registered to marry Mr. Lal. Within days, she had filled an urgent legal petition to the Delhi High Court, challenging provisions of a federal law that she and other petitioners say is both discriminatory and dangerous for interfaith couples in India who face harassment and violence. Her challenge to these provisions in the law governing interfaith unions comes at a time of rising tension over the legal rights of Muslims in the Hindu majority democracy. Last month, India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh, introduced a controversial law against what right-wing Hindu groups call love jihad, an alleged Muslim conspiracy to woo and convert Hindu brides. Police made their first arrest last week under the law, which carries a maximum penalty of 10 years in prison of a Muslim man accused of trying to lure a married Hindu woman. Several other states are preparing similar legislation, though a court-ordered probe by India's National Investigation Agency into dozens of interfaith marriages found no evidence of coercion. Earlier this year, India's Home Affairs Minister confirmed that no such cases have been registered by central agencies. Under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, India has become increasingly polarized along communal lines. Last February, riots in neighborhoods around Miss Raman's home in northeast Delhi left 53 people dead and thousands displaced, most of them Muslim. Tensions had been building for weeks as millions across the country protested the passage of an act granting citizenship to non-Muslim migrants from neighboring countries, the first time India law has used religion as a basis for citizenship. Critics say the BJP government's exclusionary use of citizenship law and its targeting of interfaith marriages are part of a political scapegoating of India's estimated 200 million Muslims. Officially, India remains a secular country in which a couple like Ms. Raymond and Mr. Law are free to marry. But the concept of secularism in India is understood as each existing peacefully within their own homes, says Asif Iqbal, co founder of Danak of Humanity, the nonprofit that supported Miss Raymond. We are not mentally prepared to exist together within the same home yet. A risky choice? Only 5% of Indian marriages are between people of different castes, according to the Indian Human Development Survey from 2011 and 2012. Estimates from 2005 to 2006 survey suggests that an additional 2.2% are interfaith. Moreover, in a culture where arranged marriages are the norm, only 5% of women said they had sole control over choosing their husband. In the Indian perspective, the right to choose is itself a big question. Religion and caste are just alibis to stop them, says Mr. Iqbal. Any couple can register under the Special Marriage Act as an alternative to religion-specific laws. The pair must first provide a district marriage registrar with names, home addresses, and photographs, which are then displayed in the registrar's office for 30 days. Anybody who wants to file an objection can do so, though the grounds are specific. For example, neither partner should have a living spouse, be underage, or be incapable of consent due to unsoundness of mind. This may sound innocuous, but the publishing of personal details puts interfaith couples at risk of public opprobrium, family arm twisting, or worse. Women who defy their family and community are often the victims of honor-based violence. India recorded 288 cases of honor killing between 2014, when it started to track the practice, and 2016. In some cases, men are victims. In 2018, Ankit Saxena, a Hindu man, was stabbed to death in New Delhi, allegedly by the relatives of his Muslim girlfriend. This summer, the government in the southern state of Kerala decided to stop publishing applications online after vigilante groups spread more than 100 registered couples' details on social media, warning of love jihad. Some other states continue to post interfaith marriage applications online. Facing such risks, many couples choose to convert and marry instead of under religious law. Ms. Raymond's petition described the 30-day notice as a breach of privacy that jeopardizes couples' life and liberty. A separate petition to the Supreme Court filed in August by a law student challenges the same provisions in the 1954 law. 2 years ago, the Law Commission of India urged reforms, including to the practice of publicizing couples' personal information and of registrars contacting their parents. It is important to ensure that at least willing couples can access the law to exercise their right to marry when social attitudes are against them, it wrote. Utkarsh Singh, a lawyer representing Miss Raymond, notes that couples who marry within a faith don't face a 30-day notice period. You don't put religious marriages to such tests, but only interfaith marriages, he says, arguing that once couples file the necessary paperwork, they should be allowed to marry whenever they choose. This narrative is not new, said Noorjehan Safia Niaz, a founding member of the Bharatiya Muslim Mahila Andolan, which advocates for Muslim Indian women's rights in reference to increasing prejudice. What is new, she says, is that with the political climate being conducive, that they, Hindu nationalists, are so open and blatant about it. Sharing their story, some Indians are coming forward to counter these narratives, and not just in court. 3 editors recently started the Indian Love Project, an Instagram feed of portraits of love outside the shackles of faith, caste, ethnicity, and gender. The idea was to create space for couples to share their stories, inspire others like them, and simply make all of us feel good about love, says co-founder Samir Halarnik. What better way to counter something that is fake than with something that is real? Nonprofits like Danek of Humanity continue to offer support, such as safe houses. In 2018, the Supreme Court ordered that special police units be formed in every district to assist couples who feared for their lives, but they are not yet a reality in most parts of the country. On October 28th, Miss Raymond and Mr. Law were finally married. Celebrations kicked off with a small gathering of couples Danek of Humanity had supported. The next morning, the bride's friend hosted a Hindu haldi ceremony when turmeric paste is applied to the bride and groom. That afternoon, witnessed by 5 friends, the couple were officially wed at a marriage office and celebrated over lunch at a mall. The kind of simple, intimate wedding Miss Raymond had always wanted. Their legal fight continues. The Delhi High Court has asked the federal and Delhi government to file a response to Miss Raymond's petition. The next hearing is scheduled for January 15th. The goal, she says, is to smooth the way for couples after them. Meanwhile, she's pursuing a bachelor's degree in education while preparing for the civil service exam. Mr. Law works as a pharmacist. Every night he returns home from work and asks what I studied that day, eager to discuss it with me, Miss Raymond says. Now that they live together, they enjoy cooking and reading together. In fact, she adds, we enjoy doing everything together. And now, curtain call for cinemas. Warner Brothers unveils a plan to stream films. Warner Brothers Pictures announced that next year its films will debut simultaneously in theaters and on HBO Max. The move has rattled the film industry as most cinemas remain closed and continue to struggle through the pandemic. By Jake Coyle, Associated Press. In New York, in the most seismic shift by a Hollywood studio yet during the pandemic, Warner Brothers Pictures on Thursday announced that all of its 2021 film slate, including the new Matrix movie, Godzilla vs. Kong, and the Lin-Manuel Miranda In the Heights adaptation, will stream on HBO Max at the same time the film plays in theaters. Among the myriad release plan changes wrought by the pandemic, no studio has so fully embraced streaming as a lifeline. But after disappointing domestic ticket sales for Tenet, and with the majority of American theaters currently closed, the AT&T-owned Warner Brothers will turn to a hybrid distribution model next year. Films will debut simultaneously in theaters and on HBO Max in the United States. After 1 month, they will stop streaming and to continue to play only in theaters. The move follows Warner Brothers' decision to put Wonder Woman 1984 on HBO Max in December, along with a concurrent theatrical run. If that pivot sends shockwaves through the industry, Thursday's announcement rattled Hollywood to the core. Given the unprecedented time that we're in, we needed a creative solution to address our fans, our filmmakers, our exhibitors, says Ann Sarnoff, chief executive of Warner Media Studios, in an interview. Big and bold is a necessity right now. Ms. Sarnoff called it a temporary solution and a 1-year plan. The studio said other options, releasing big budget films solely in reduced capacity theaters or delaying films another year, weren't appealing. Warner Brothers' move amounts to an acknowledgement that any full rebound for theaters is still a year away or more. We've got to get people back in theaters at full capacity at some point. If you read the medical experts, that's going to take a while to work its way through the system, says Ms. Sarnoff. If we saw an end in sight to the pandemic, we might have a different strategy, but we don't see that at this moment. HBO Max is only available in the U.S. internationally. The studio's 17 films planned for 2021 release will roll out exclusively in theaters. Warner Brothers' decision resonates especially because the 117-year-old studio responsible for classics such as The Wizard of Oz and Casablanca have long been a market leader in Hollywood, and also one known as especially supportive of theaters. The studio has generally ranked among the top 2 studios in market share over the past decade, most recently dwarfed only by Walt Disney. Warner's films typically account for $1.5 to $2 billion annual in ticket sales in North America. A lot of money to compensate for in HBO Max subscribers, Warner Brothers confirmed the films will be available to subscribers with no further charge. I can't comment on the economics of how it will all work. I'd need a crystal ball for that, says Ms. Sarnoff. But I'm very optimistic that this is a win-win-win for our fans, our filmmakers, and our exhibitors. We're getting the movies out. We're allowing them to be seen on the big screen, which is what they were made for, but giving an alternative. The hybrid approach also allows us to market them in a fuller way than we would have had we just looked at the less than full capacities in theatrical right now. Warner Brothers' 2021 slate includes many of the expected top movies of the year, including Dune, The Suicide Squad, Tom and Jerry, The Conjuring, The Devil Make Me Do It, King Richard, and Judas and the Black Messiah. The move by Warner Brothers only makes the pain being felt by exhibitors all the more acute. Having been shuttered for much of the year, cinemas reopened nationwide in late summer, except in some key locations, including Los Angeles and New York. But with most major releases postponed and virus cases surging, about 60% of the theaters have since closed again. Regal Cinemas, the country's second largest chain, has shut all its doors. Following Warner Brothers' announcement, shares of AMC Entertainment fell 16%. Cinemark was down 22%. AMC vehemently disagreed with Warner Brothers' strategy. Adam Aron, chief executive of the world's largest chain, said AMC had gone along with the Wonder Woman 1984 plans because of the virus surge. But he said AMC would oppose the same approach into 2021 when a vaccine could accelerate a recovery. Clearly, Warner Media intends to sacrifice a considerable portion of the profitability of its movie studio and that of its production partners and filmmakers to subsidize HBO Max, said Mr. Aron in a statement. As for AMC, we will do all in our power to ensure that Warner does not do so at our expense. Under Chief Executive Jason Kilar, the former Hulu chief, Warner Media recently reorganized to further prioritize its streaming service. He has moved aggressively to boost HBO Max, even if it comes at the expense of the theatrical marketplace. After a rocky rollout, HBO Max said in October that nearly 9 million people were using the platform, though 29 million had access to the streaming service as part of their HBO subscriptions. For comparison, Disney Plus has about 74 million subscribers through its available worldwide. Our content is extremely valuable unless it's sitting on a shelf not being seen by anyone, says Mr. Kilar in a statement. We believe this approach serves our fans, supports exhibitors and filmmakers, and enhances the HBO Max experience, creating value for all. It's the latest in a series of sea changes sweeping through an industry convulsed by the pandemic. The demise of the traditional 90-day theater window, something long sought by some in Hollywood, has accelerated, and many think it's gone for good. Universal Pictures last month made deals with both AMC theaters and Cinemark to give them the option of shifting movies into home release after just 17 days in theater. Disney has postponed most of its releases, but redirected Hamilton, Mulan, and the upcoming Pixar release Soul to Disney+. Up next, work-from-home fathers rethink parenting. Couples who have school-aged children and can work from home are resetting traditional parenting roles. After the pandemic, old notions of fatherhood may not hold anymore. By the Monitor's editorial board. Couples with school-aged children don't have it easy right now. Much or all of a child's education is likely happening at home. Who's making sure the internet connection is good, let alone making sure real learning is taking place? In many households in which both parents can work from home, home-based learning during the pandemic has opened up a debate about gender roles in parenting and in deciding how to divvy up child rearing. Mothers and fathers, especially fathers, may be taking on new views of themselves. Even before the pandemic, many fathers had stepped up to their parenting game. In 2018, married mothers who worked full time spent 1.2 hours each day caring for their children, but married fathers chipped in 49 minutes per day, reported the American Time Use Survey. The women spent another 2.1 hours each day on other household chores, with husbands contributing about 1.4 hours. What comes as a pleasant surprise now is how much fathers stuck at home are enjoying more time with their children. In a study released by Harvard University after the pandemic began, 68% of dads said they felt closer or much closer to their children, and 57% said they appreciated their children more. It's no longer a professional embarrassment if during dad's Zoom meeting a child wanders into the room wanting a glass of water. It's a chance to proudly lift the child onto his lap and introduce them. One father reports that he found his 6 and 9-year-old sons running around the house didn't annoy him, just the opposite. I noticed the total bliss I felt, he told the Wall Street Journal, and the feeling that I didn't want to be anywhere else. Another young dad told The Guardian, I'll be honest, all my dad friends share the same view. Lockdown has been an absolute blessing in terms of spending time with our children and seeing them grow and develop. I have no hankering to get back to the way it was before. Mental and social barriers to male buy-in to parenting responsibilities still remain. The assumption that husbands will be the primary breadwinner has softened, but it hasn't disappeared. That pressure can push back against fatherly inclinations to spend more time at home. Men are also less likely to receive paternity leave, paid or unpaid, or feel comfortable taking it, if offered. And a lingering macho mentality may make fathers less comfortable talking about the challenges of parenting with their spouse or male friends. When the pandemic eases, the ability to return to the office opens up. Like all workers, fathers will weigh the advantage of being present in the office against stay-at-home pluses such as no commuting hassles. But for dads who form new, closer bonds with their children, that advantage may be the hardest to give up. And finally, tips on how to become a Viz Wiz by Melissa Moore. 3 Latin abbreviations cause no end of confusion in English. Viz, i.e., e.g., and Viz itself. I had to think carefully about the correct way to use Viz here because it's an abbreviation I have often read. 18th and 19th century texts are chock full of Viz, yet never before employed, i.e., and e.g., can be confounding enough without bringing Viz into it. They are frequently confused even by the most conscientious writers, according to Merriam-Webster. The 3 abbreviations seem to have appeared in the 15th and 16th centuries when English speakers were in the habit of poaching terms from Latin legalese, e.g., exempli grata, by way of example, is by far the most popular today according to Google Books' Nagram Viewer. It is basically a fancy way to say for example, and it is used to introduce specific examples of a more general topic or point. She trains big dogs, e.g., Great Danes, Mastiffs, Rottweilers. E.g. also implies that what follows is not an exhaustive list. Our trainer may also work with Irish Wolfhounds, so it is redundant to conclude with etc. or and so on. If you're trying to figure out whether it's the right abbreviation for your sentence, this mnemonic might be helpful. E.g. equals example given. IE stands for id est, or that is. In English, it is best translated as that is to say, as in my dog is a typical Great Dane, i.e., large, loyal, and friendly. According to Fowler Modern English Usage, IE introduces another way of putting what has already been said. It is a restatement of what has come before. This can trespass into EG territory when the restatement comprises a comprehensive list. She trains big dogs, i.e., Great Danes, Mastiffs, and Rottweilers. In this case, IE indicates that she trains only these 3 dog breeds. The mnemonic I like for IE is in essence. Then there's Viz, short for videlicet. It is permissible to see, in Latin, pronounced videlicet, which was once the most popular of these abbreviations. In 1810, it was used about 10 times more frequently than either IE or EG, appearing not just in scholarly treatises and legal briefs, but in personal letters and diaries. Writers sprinkled it so liberally across their compositions that modern maverns have a hard time pinning down rules for its use. Like IE, Viz can preface an exhaustive list, so the University of North Carolina Writing Center calls it a stronger version of IE, but others stress differences between the two, finding that where IE paraphrases its antecedent, Viz clarifies it or adds more detail. What most modern experts do agree on is that Viz has had its day. IE and EG are enough to handle by themselves. As language expert Brian Garner jokes, how does one pronounce Viz? Preferably by saying namely. That concludes the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, December 11th. Please stay safe, be blessed, and do what you could do to make it a great day.